Tobias Marsh returned to the mansion on the hill close to midnight, without a word of warning. No one knew he was back. For 5 months, that house had been silent as a grave, ever since the night Diane never walked through its doors again. But tonight something was different. The moment he stepped into the hall, a sound drifted out from deep within the house. Tobias froze, the hand that had never trembled while pulling a trigger, while giving an order, while watching an enemy fall to his knees. That same hand now gripped the banister tight. That sound, he knew it, and yet he could not believe it. It was laughter. The laughter of children. He moved toward it, faster with every step, down the dark hallway, past doors long shut, unopened for months. His heart pounded, slamming against his ribs. For 5 months his 2 little daughters had not uttered a single word, not one sound, and yet now, drifting out from the kitchen, came their giggling bright, joyful, alive, as if nothing had ever happened. He placed his hand on the door. He hesitated for a second, the man the whole port city feared, the one who had never backed down from anything, now afraid to push open a door in his own home. He pushed it open. And there, beneath the warm golden kitchen light, he saw his 2 little girls perched on the counter, faces glowing, singing. Beside them, a woman he had never seen hummed softly along, her gentle hands folding small dresses. A stranger, in his house, who had done the one thing his money, his power, and all his long months could never do. Tobias's entire world stood still. He should have fallen to his knees in gratitude. But what rose in his chest that night was not gratitude, it was something far darker, and it was about to destroy everything. If this story touched your heart, leave a like and share it so it can reach even more people. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you never miss the next heartfelt story. To understand Harrow Bay, one had to step back a little, to the time before that fateful night, in order to see who Tobias Marsh truly was in this harbor city. People didn't call him by his name. In Harrow Bay, they called him the Man of the Docks, and those 3 words alone were enough to make even the most stubborn men lower their voices. Every crate that came into port, every ship that left the wharf, every hidden contract that moved through the eastern loading district had to pass through his nod. He didn't need to put on a show. Real power never needed to raise its voice. It only needed to be present, quiet and absolute, like frost lying over the water at daybreak. Late one afternoon, when the sea wind began to turn cold, Tobias walked into the old fish market, pressed close against the edge of the harbor. He moved between the stalls in a dark coat, his steps unhurried. At the far end of the row, a large man was backing a fish seller into a corner, his hand slamming hard against the damp wooden counter. His name was Briggs, a man who made a living collecting protection money, the kind of man who believed that if his fists were big enough, he could demand anything he wanted. The woman was trembling, both hands clutching the tin box that held the coins she had earned over the whole day. She begged him, saying business had been poor that month, that her little child was sick, that she was only asking for a few more days. Briggs didn't listen. He snatched the box from her hands. Tobias stopped a few steps away. He didn't shout. He simply spoke, his voice low and calm enough to chill the blood. Put the box down. Briggs spun around, ready to spit out some insolent words. But when he recognized the man standing before him, his face went deathly pale. The tin box slipped from his hand and rolled across the stone floor. "Mr. Marsh, I didn't know this was your territory. This isn't my territory." Tobias took one step forward. "This is hers. It belongs to the people who get up at 4 o'clock in the morning to sell fish one by one." "You collect money from them in whose name?" Briggs stammered out a name. "Some small gang from the other side of the city." Tobias gave a slow nod, as though committing it to memory, then signaled to the man behind him. From the shadows between the stalls, a man stepped out, tall in build, sharp-eyed, moving without a sound. It was Gideon, Tobias's right hand, the man who had followed him for 10 years. The only person he trusted with matters that could never be spoken aloud. "Take him back to his people," Tobias said softly to Gideon. "Tell them that if anyone sets foot in the fish market again, there won't be a second time to explain." Gideon only nodded. He gripped Briggs by the shoulder and led him away behind the row of warehouses, without one unnecessary word. Their footsteps faded into the distance, then disappeared completely beneath the sound of waves striking the pier. Tobias bent down and picked up the tin box. He brushed the dust from its lid, then placed it back in the woman's hands. She looked at him, her eyes still wet, her lips moving though no words of thanks could come out. He didn't wait for that thank you. He only said, so quietly it was almost meant for her alone, "Go home to your child. It's nearly dark." Then he turned and walked away. In the underworld Tobias ruled. There was an unwritten law that everyone who followed him had to know by heart. He could be ruthless toward the strong who preyed on the weak. He could make an entire gang fall apart in a single night, but never, not even once, would he let his hand touch a woman, a child, or a poor person trying to live an honest life. That was the line he had drawn for himself, the one line that neither power nor money could ever buy him into crossing. People said Tobias Marsh was a man without a heart. They were wrong. He had a heart. It was only buried very deep, behind the walls he had built over so many years. And it wouldn't be until the night he pushed open that kitchen door that he understood that heart was still beating, still knew how to ache, and that there was still one thing in this world powerful enough to break it apart. The night that changed everything happened on a November evening. 5 months before Tobias pushed open that kitchen door. Diane was all the gentleness that remained in his life. She didn't belong to the world of the docks, of midnight meetings, of words that only needed to be spoken once. She belonged to the light, to mornings spent making coffee in a sun-filled kitchen, to the laughter of the twin daughters she loved more than her own breath. Tobias had once believed he was strong enough to keep the dark world outside from ever touching her. He was wrong. That night, Diane drove home alone after taking the 2 girls to visit their grandmother. And on the empty harbor road, another car blocked her path. It wasn't an accident. It was an act of revenge aimed straight at Tobias, a warning from those who wanted him to pay for the power he held. The news reached him while he was in another city, sitting in the middle of a negotiation whose contents he could no longer remember. He only remembered the moment the phone slipped from his hand. He remembered the feeling of the whole room collapsing around him. He remembered that he hadn't made it in time to say goodbye. Diane died that very night, and with her, a part of Tobias died too. There was one small detail that he would not realize was strange until much later, a detail that, at the time, had been drowned beneath so much grief that he hadn't had the strength to care. On the night Diane was killed, Gideon was the first person to arrive at the scene, earlier than the police, so early that no one could understand how he had known to come. Back then, Tobias only felt grateful that there was someone loyal enough to handle everything while he was falling apart. Only much later, when all the broken pieces began to fit together, did he suddenly ask himself why Gideon had been in that exact place that night, at that exact hour. But that belonged to later. In that moment, the only thing Tobias could see was his 2 little girls. Poppy and Maisie were just over 4 years old then, 2 faces as alike as 2 drops of water, with 2 heads of soft brown hair and the bright eyes they had inherited from their mother. Before that night, the house had always been filled with their voices. Poppy used to ask questions about everything in the world, asking why the sea was salty, why the stars blinked, why the sun had to go to sleep. Maisie sang, singing little melodies that belonged to no song at all, making up the words as she played with her dolls. But from the day their mother died, both girls withdrew into themselves. Poppy's questions fell silent. Maisie's songs disappeared as well. They didn't cry, didn't scream. They simply stopped speaking, as if the grief was too vast and had drained every word from their tender young mouths. The sisters held tightly to each other's hands and sat for hours by the window overlooking the sea, silent inside a world no grown person could enter. Tobias took them to the best doctors. He brought in every specialist money could reach, but nothing moved that silence. And then, like every man who didn't know how to face his own pain, Tobias chose to run from it. He buried himself in work, stretched his trips away longer and longer, accepted every negotiation in other cities, because staying in that house, facing his daughter's silence, and the memories of Diane engraved into every wall, was more than he had the strength to endure. Every time he left, he told himself he was doing it to protect them, to keep the underworld from ever touching them again. But deep inside, he knew he was only running away, and the farther he ran, the more the distance between him and his 2 children became as impossible as 2 shores of an ocean, with not a single ship to bring them back together. The only person in that house who didn't give up was Eleanor Pike, the housekeeper who had been tied to the Marsh family since the days when Diane was still a new bride stepping across the threshold. She had witnessed everything, from the mornings overflowing with laughter to the night when everything shattered, and she couldn't stand by and watch the 2 children sink any deeper into silence for even one more day. One evening, During one of the rare times Tobias was actually home, Eleanor knocked on the door of his study. She didn't speak in circles. She told him that she couldn't care for the two girls by herself, that this house was too large and too cold, that the children needed someone beside them all day, someone with a warmth that she, no matter how much she loved them, had grown too old to give completely. She asked him for permission to hire another person. Tobias sat in silence for a long time behind his desk, the lamplight falling across his exhausted face. In his world, allowing a stranger into the house where his two daughters lived was no different from throwing open a gate that his enemies were waiting to slip through. After Diane's death, he understood better than anyone the price of a single careless moment. But looking into Eleanor's determined eyes, he knew she was right. At last, he nodded, but with one uncompromising condition. Anyone who stepped into this house had to be investigated down to the smallest thread. Their past, their family, every place they had ever worked, every relationship they had ever had. Not a single detail could be missed. His people spent nearly 3 weeks reviewing the list of applicants Eleanor had given them, and in the end, only one name made it through everything. Ruth Calloway, 28 years old, a woman who worked as a hired cleaner and lived in the poor working district on the other side of the city. Her background was so clean it was almost transparent, without a single stain, without one suspicious connection, only a hard life that could be read between the dry lines of official papers. On the day Ruth came to take the job, she walked through the great gate with an old cloth bag over her shoulder and a slow, steady way of moving. She was a full-figured woman, not the kind of shape people usually pictured when they thought of elegant houses on the hill, and that didn't escape the eyes of some of the household staff. Someone looked her up and down and curled their lip faintly. Someone else whispered behind her back, wondering where Eleanor had found a woman who looked so lacking in quickness, wondering whether she could possibly keep up with the work in a house this large. Ruth heard it all. It wasn't that she didn't know what people said about her, because all her life she had been used to eyes like that, to the kind of glances that measured a person by their outward shape, before ever taking the time to know who they were. But she didn't answer, didn't defend herself. She only lowered her head slightly in greeting to the people in the house, then quietly set down her bag and began to work. There was something in Ruth that those whispers couldn't see, something buried deep in her eyes. It was an old, quiet sadness, the kind of sorrow carried only by those who had already passed through loss, a sorrow that didn't need to be spoken of, yet was still present in every gesture, in the way she paused softly each time she passed the room where the two children were. Eleanor was the one who led her through the house, and when they reached the door to the girls' room, she lowered her voice and told Ruth about Poppy and Maisie, about the silence that had lasted for 5 months, about the doctors who had come and gone, leaving nothing behind but disappointment. Ruth didn't say much. She only looked through the narrow opening of the half-open door, where the two little girls were sitting hand in hand by the window, two small, motionless shadows against the evening sky, and in that moment, something inside her chest tightened. She didn't promise Eleanor anything. She didn't say she would be able to heal them, because she understood better than anyone that some wounds couldn't be cured with words. She only gave a small nod, and in that quiet nod there was something she herself had not yet found a name for, a silent understanding between her and the two children she had never known. Ruth began her work in a way no one in the house had expected. She didn't rush into the girls' room with new toys, didn't try to start a conversation, didn't kneel in front of them and ask questions in that false, sweet voice adults so often use with children. She understood that children who had withdrawn that deeply would only curl further into themselves before anyone who deliberately tried to force their way into their world. Instead, she chose the simplest way, and also the hardest. She simply remained present. Every morning, she came to the girls' room, knocked softly, and stepped inside, not waiting for an answer, and not needing one either. She set about cleaning, straightening the blankets and pillows, wiping dust from the bookshelves, folding the tiny clothes, and placing them neatly into the drawers. And as she worked, she sang, not loud songs, not cheerful tunes meant to be bright on purpose, but old, gentle melodies, lullabies she herself had heard when she was little, hummed so softly it seemed she was singing only for herself. At first, Poppy and Maisie still sat motionless by the window, holding each other's hands, showing no sign that they noticed the strange woman quietly working in their room. But Ruth didn't mind. She didn't look toward them, didn't try to make eye contact, didn't create even the smallest pressure. She was simply there, day after day, steady as the rise and fall of the tide outside the harbor, allowing her patience to do the work that words could not do. On the third day, something very small happened. So small that no one would have noticed it unless they were paying attention. As Ruth was folding towels beside the table and singing under her breath, she felt someone watching her. She didn't turn around. She only glanced very quickly from the corner of her eye and saw that Poppy had left the window and was standing tucked behind the bedroom door, one cheek pressed against the wooden frame, silently observing her. Ruth's heart gave a small ache of joy, one she had to try very hard not to show. She knew that if she turned back, if she smiled or called the child by name, that fragile moment would shatter, and Poppy would retreat into her shell again. So Ruth did nothing at all. She kept folding the towels, kept singing, letting the little girl stand there and watch for as long as she wished, safe within the distance she had chosen for herself. The next day, Poppy came again to stand in the doorway, this time a little longer. The day after that, she stood closer, only a few steps away from Ruth, her bright eyes following every movement of Ruth's hands. Ruth kept the same quiet rhythm, without hurry, without pressure, like a gardener sowing seeds and then patiently waiting, understanding that some things could not be rushed, that a green shoot only rises when the soil is warm enough and the roots are strong enough. She didn't tell anyone about those small things. She didn't boast to Eleanor that she had accomplished anything, because to Ruth, this wasn't an achievement to show off. It was something sacred that needed to be held gently in silence. Maisie still stayed by the window and had not yet left her place, but Ruth noticed that sometimes the little girl would tilt her head slightly when Ruth began to sing, as if the melody had touched some hidden place inside her that even she didn't understand. And so, day by day, the woman whom the whole house had once regarded with doubtful eyes began to do what money and the finest doctors had not been able to do. She didn't heal the two children with magic. She simply gave them what they had been missing for the past 5 months: a warm, steadfast, undemanding presence, someone willing to stay long enough for them to believe that the world was still safe enough to step back into. What no one in that house on the hill knew, not even Eleanor, was why Ruth understood those two children so deeply, why she was never awkward before their silence the way others had been, why she knew exactly how patient she had to be, and why she must never hurry. The answer lay in a hidden corner of her life, one she had never told anyone here. 3 years earlier, Ruth had once been a mother. She had a son, a little boy with dimples in his cheeks and a bright, ringing laugh that could light up even the darkest room. But illness had come, quiet and cruel, and had taken her little child from her before he had even turned 3. She had sat beside his sickbed through the long nights, had held that tiny hand until it slowly grew cold inside her own, and she had learned something no one ever wants to learn, that there are griefs so great they drain every word out of a person and leave behind a silence that only those who have passed through it can truly understand. That was why, when she saw Poppy and Maisie sitting motionless by the window, Ruth didn't see 2 children who needed pity. She saw herself from 3 years before. She saw the familiar sorrow hidden behind those young eyes. And she knew that what they needed wasn't hollow comfort or expensive toys, but someone willing to sit with them in the dark without trying to pull them into the light too soon. One afternoon, after she had finished cleaning the room and Eleanor had taken the 2 girls down to the yard to play, Ruth stayed behind alone. She was straightening a stack of little clothes when her hand touched a pale blue sweater belonging to one of the girls, soft and warm, the very color she had once knitted for her son during the last winter he was still with her. And suddenly, before she could guard herself against it, memory came rushing back like a wave. Ruth sank down onto the edge of the bed, pressed the sweater to her chest, and let the tears she had hidden for so long fall in silence. She didn't sob. She didn't cry out. She only sat there trembling quietly, her shoulders quivering, while the longing for her child clawed at her heart as if that wound had never truly healed. She wept for the child she had lost. She wept for the 2 children growing up without their mother's arms around them. She wept for all the losses that life kept piling onto people who had done nothing to deserve them. But Ruth didn't allow herself to collapse for too long. She knew the 2 girls would soon return, and the last thing they needed to see was the tear-soaked face of the only person who was beginning to make them feel safe. So she drew in a deep breath, wiped her face dry with the back of her hand, smoothed her clothes neatly back into place, then folded that pale blue sweater with great care and set it on top of the stack like a silent greeting sent to her own little child. When the sound of small footsteps rose in the hallway, Ruth was once again the calm and warm woman she was every day. Her eyes still a little red, but her smile already back on her lips. She turned to welcome the two girls, and in the look she gave them at that moment, there was a feeling deeper than compassion, an invisible thread tying together hearts that had been broken by the same kind of loss. Of course, the children were still too young to understand everything this woman had lived through, but perhaps in some deep place that words could not reach, they could sense that she understood them, that she hadn't come here to fix them as one might fix a broken object, but to stay with them, and that was what made all the difference. By the third week, the distance between Ruth and the two children began to narrow in small but meaningful ways. Maisie, the little girl who had always remained by the window the longest, left her familiar place one morning. She said nothing, didn't look straight at Ruth, only quietly edged over and sat down on the rug in the middle of the room, closer to where Ruth was working, and there she tilted her head to listen as the woman hummed those old melodies. Ruth noticed the change at once, but she kept her calm expression, as if nothing had happened. She only sang a little louder, a little more clearly, letting her voice become a gentle hand extended in invitation without ever forcing anything. Maisie sat there, morning after morning, her eyes following Ruth, her small lips sometimes moving as if she wanted to sing along, then stopping again, as though the song was still locked somewhere inside her and she hadn't yet found the way to open it. Poppy followed a different path. She had always been curious, always liked to observe, and her closeness to Ruth showed itself through action rather than through sitting and listening. One afternoon, after Ruth had finished cleaning and stepped out of the room to put away a stack of clean towels, she came back and discovered something new on the neatly folded pile of towels at the head of the bed. It was a drawing, made with crayons on a white sheet of paper, with the young and clumsy strokes of a 4-year-old child. The picture showed a house, a yellow sun spreading curved rays of light, and beneath it were 3 human shapes holding hands, 2 small ones and 1 larger one. Ruth stood still, looking at that drawing, and she understood at once what it was. It wasn't only a picture. It was the first door Poppy had opened a crack, the way the little girl was saying what her mouth still couldn't speak aloud. Ruth picked up the drawing with both hands, gently, as if she were lifting something terribly fragile and precious. She didn't cry out in joy, didn't hurry to praise it loudly, because she knew that children like Poppy feared too much attention more than anything. Instead, she found an empty space on the wall near the girl's bed, and carefully taped the drawing there, straight and neat, at just the right height, so both sisters could see it every morning when they woke. When Poppy walked into the room and saw her drawing respectfully placed on the wall, something happened in her eyes. The gaze that had been hollow and far away for the past 5 months suddenly lit up, only for a moment, like a faint ray of sunlight piercing through thick clouds after a long rain. She looked at the drawing, then looked at Ruth, and in that brief moment, 2 people, separated by more than 20 years, understood each other without needing a single word. Ruth only gave the child a small nod, a nod of recognition and respect, then turned back to her work as if nothing important had just happened, allowing Poppy to keep that tiny joy fully for herself without feeling pressured to respond in any way. From that day on, the drawings began to appear more regularly, one each day. Sometimes they showed a boat out by the harbor, sometimes a cat, sometimes only messy streaks of color, with no clear shape at all. And Ruth cherished every one of them, taping each picture to that wall until it slowly became a bright patch of color in a room that had once felt so cold. And then, on a morning near the end of the 5th week, while Ruth was humming a familiar melody as she straightened the bookshelf, she heard a sound that made her whole body freeze halfway through her movement. It was very soft, almost no more than a breath, but clearly real. Maisie was humming along with her. The little girl wasn't singing words, only making a small murmur that followed the melody. But to Ruth, that tiny sound was more precious than any piece of music she had ever heard in her life, because she knew the final door into the children's world had finally begun to open. Maisie, humming along with the melody that day, was the beginning of something Ruth had waited for with all the patience she possessed, and yet she still couldn't prepare herself for the moment when it truly came. In the days that followed, Maisie's humming grew clearer. It was no longer just a faint breath, but sounds with shape and weight, and sometimes the little girl would part her lips and make a few broken, uncertain syllables, like a child learning to speak again after a long sleep. Ruth received every one of those sounds the way dry earth receives the first rain of the season, not greedily, not with pressure, only quietly watering them with her steady tenderness. Then, one morning, when the sun had just risen and the whole room was filled with warm, golden light, everything changed forever in a single moment. Ruth was sitting on the edge of the bed, folding tiny socks while singing softly as usual, when Maisie ran to her side. The little girl caught her foot on the edge of the rug and almost fell, and by instinct, Ruth reached out to catch her, keeping her from tumbling onto the floor. Maisie lifted her head and looked at her, her round eyes still carrying a trace of fright, and then from those small lips came a call the child hadn't spoken for 5 whole months, a call that perhaps even she didn't realize she was saying. Mama. That one word was small, so fragile, but it rang through the quiet room like the sound of a bell, and Ruth went utterly still. The hands that were holding Maisie froze in midair. Her whole body seemed to turn to stone. For 1 second, she didn't breathe, didn't move, didn't do anything except look into the innocent face turned up toward her, the face of a child who had just accidentally called her by the most sacred name a woman could ever be called, the name Ruth herself had once been given, and then had lost 3 years before. A wave of emotion rose inside Ruth's chest, so powerful she could hardly hold it back. There was a bursting happiness in knowing that this little girl, this child who had been silent for so long, had finally found her voice again. There was an aching tightness when that call touched the deepest wound in Ruth's heart and awakened the image of the son she had lost. And there was also a moment of tender confusion, because she knew she wasn't Maisie's mother, knew she could never replace the mother the child had lost. But in this moment, the little girl was trusting her and leaning on her as though she were truly a mother. Slowly, Ruth drew Maisie into her arms, holding that small, warm body against her, and let a single tear roll down her cheek. She didn't correct the child's words. She didn't say that she wasn't her mother, because doing that now would only wound a heart that had just begun to open. She only stroked Maisie's soft brown hair and whispered that she was here, that the child was safe now, that everything was going to be all right. At the threshold, someone had been standing silently for some time. Eleanor, the old housekeeper, had witnessed the whole moment. She raised a hand to cover her mouth, her shoulders trembling, tears running down her time-worn face. For the past 5 months, she had watched the 2 children sink into silence. She had watched so many doctors come and go in hopelessness. She had once thought that perhaps laughter and voices would never return to this house again. And yet now, the woman the whole household had once regarded with doubtful eyes, the woman people had once looked down on because of her outward shape, was the very one who had created the miracle that money and power had both been helpless to bring about. Eleanor quietly stepped back from the door, unwilling to break that sacred moment, her heart filled with a deep gratitude. But even she, in that moment of emotion, couldn't have imagined that this sweet call of Mama, this beautiful moment itself, was about to become the spark that lit a tragedy no one could have foreseen. For the first 3 seconds, Tobias could only stand there and let the surge of emotion sweep him away. For 5 long months, he had grown used to a house without human voices, used to the sight of his 2 children sitting motionless in silence, so much so that he had believed their sounds had left his life forever. And yet now, right before his eyes, his little daughters were coming back to life in the truest sense of those words, their cheeks rosy, their eyes shining, their clear singing voices rising as though those dark 5 months had never passed at all. A vast relief welled up inside his chest, so powerful that he had to grip the doorframe to keep himself from collapsing. It was a feeling he had no longer dared to dream of, a feeling as if someone had just returned to him the things he had thought were lost forever, as if the sky, after so many storm-filled nights, had finally opened enough to let a ray of light through. In that brief moment, Tobias almost wanted to fall to his knees and give thanks to fate, wanted to rush forward and gather his children into his arms, wanted to burst into tears like a child, but then everything changed with a single call. Maisie, completely unaware that her father was standing at the threshold, looked up at the woman beside her and cried out in a bright, innocent voice, "Sing louder, please, sing louder." That sentence, which should have been harmless and sweet, struck Tobias in the heart like an ice-cold knife. Because inside that sentence was a truth he couldn't bear. His daughter, the child for whom he had brought in so many of the finest doctors, the child he had taken everywhere, the child into whom he had poured more money and effort than he could even count, was smiling and speaking again, was coming back to life, not because of him, not in his arms, but in the arms of a strange woman he had never even met. And what rose inside Tobias at that moment was not the gratitude he should have felt. It was much darker than that. It was jealousy, that ugly, poisonous feeling he had thought himself too strong ever to suffer from. The man who had faced the most dangerous enemies without so much as blinking, the man who had never known fear before anything, was now brought to his knees by one innocent sentence from his 4-year-old child. He looked at the warm scene before him and felt only coldness in his heart. That woman had done what he, the children's own father, had been completely powerless to do. She had stepped into his house. She had touched his daughters' hearts. She had filled the empty place that should have belonged to him, and in a mind clouded by pain and shame, Tobias could no longer see a miracle. He saw only proof of his own failure, a cruel reminder that while he had been busy running away through city after city, burying himself in negotiations and distant trips, here in this very house, someone else had become the parent his children needed. The feeling of being replaced, of being pushed outside, of being proven useless in his own home, rose in a violent tide and drowned out all the joy he had felt only seconds earlier. Tobias's reason screamed at him that he should be happy, that this was what he had prayed for throughout the past 5 months, that this woman deserved to have him kneel down and thank her. But the storm of emotion raging inside him was far stronger than reason, and it drove him toward the edge of a decision he would regret for the rest of his life. And then that storm broke open. Tobias's voice rose, echoing through the kitchen, cold and sharp as steel. What is going on here? The singing died out in an instant, like a candle snuffed by the wind. The whole room, which had been filled with joy only moments before, suddenly froze. Ruth startled and turned sharply toward the door, and when she realized the man standing there was the master of the house, the father of the 2 children, her hands trembled faintly. Quickly but carefully, she helped Maisie down from the kitchen counter, set the child firmly on the floor, then straightened and faced the fury rushing toward her. "Mr. Marsh," she said, her voice small but still steady, "I was only—" But Tobias didn't give her the chance to finish. "I didn't hire you to do these things," he shouted, each word falling like the blow of a hammer. "You were hired to clean, not to put on little performances, not to turn my kitchen into a stage. Who do you think you are, putting my children on the kitchen counter like that? What if they had fallen? What if something had happened? Who would be responsible then?" Ruth tried to explain that she had been watching them carefully the entire time, that both girls were completely safe, but every word she spoke was swept aside by his anger. "You're fired," Tobias said, and this time his voice dropped lower, so cold and final that there was no room left for any plea. "Gather your things and leave this house at once." Ruth stood still for a moment, both hands tightening around the hem of her dress. Her eyes glistened with tears, but she didn't let a single one fall in front of him. She didn't beg, didn't argue, didn't sink to her knees and plead as perhaps some hidden part of him had expected her to do. She only lowered her head slightly, and in a voice choked with pain yet still whole with dignity, she answered, "Yes, sir." Then she turned and walked away, her back straight, her head held high, and only after she had passed Tobias, when her face had moved beyond the children's sight, did the tears begin to roll silently down her cheeks. Meanwhile, in one corner of the kitchen, the 2 little girls stood pressed close together. The bright joy that had lit their faces only a moment ago had gone out, as if someone had pulled a curtain over the sunlight. Poppy and Maisie didn't burst into tears. They didn't scream. They only held each other's hands tightly and lowered their heads, their eyes returning to that empty, distant look that everyone had thought was finally gone after all these weeks. They watched the woman who had brought them laughter and song slowly disappear beyond the door, and in their young eyes appeared a silent emptiness, the sorrow of children who had just lost something precious before they had even learned how to hold on to it. Maisie's lips moved faintly, as if she wanted to call after Ruth with the voice she had only just found again, but no sound came out, and she only gripped her sister's hand more tightly. The door closed behind Ruth. The sound of her footsteps faded, then vanished down the long hallway, and the kitchen, which only a few minutes earlier had been overflowing with sunlight and song, now sank into a silence so heavy it felt suffocating. Tobias stood there, alone in the middle of the room, and the anger inside him began to cool, leaving space for another feeling to rise, something vague and frightening that he had not yet found the name for. On the kitchen counter, the little dresses Ruth had not finished folding were still lying there. On the wall upstairs, in that room above them, there were still crayon drawings he had never seen. He looked at his 2 daughters standing with their heads bowed in silence. He looked at how quickly joy had left them, and a question began to slip into his mind. a question whose answer he was afraid to face. What have I just done? But it was already too late to take back the words he had spoken. And the silence slowly closing around the house once again was the cruelest answer he never wanted to hear. That night, Tobias sat alone in his study, the dim yellow lamplight falling across his exhausted face. A glass of whiskey poured but untouched on the desk before him. He simply sat there, staring blankly into the empty space, his mind tangled by the vague feeling that had risen in him that afternoon and refused to be pushed away. There was a soft knock at the door, and then Eleanor stepped inside. She didn't bring tea as she usually did, and she didn't sit down. She only stood there, her hands clasped together, looking at him with the eyes of someone who had witnessed too much and had nothing left to hide. "Sir," she said, her voice low and slow, "do you know what you did today?" Tobias looked up, his expression tightening into a frown. "I know what I did, Eleanor. I dismissed a servant who overstepped her duties." Eleanor shook her head, and in that shake of her head, there was a heavy disappointment. "No, sir. You don't understand. You don't understand what you just destroyed." She paused for a moment, as if gathering courage for the words she was about to speak. "The girls have started talking again, sir. Not just today. It's been going on for weeks." Tobias went utterly still. The hand holding his glass trembled faintly, and he quickly set it down on the desk, as though it had suddenly become too heavy. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice rough and hoarse. Eleanor stepped one step closer. "Miss Ruth brought them back, little by little, day by day, over these past weeks. At first it was only glances, then drawings, then humming along to the songs, and only recently, little Maisie spoke her first words after 5 months of silence. They have laughed again, sung again, lived again, sir. The miracle that so many of the finest doctors couldn't bring about, that woman did, only with her patience and her heart." Each word from Eleanor cut into Tobias like a knife. He sat there, motionless, while the whole world around him seemed to collapse. For all these weeks, right inside his own house, his children had been coming back to life, had been finding their voices and their laughter again, and he hadn't known, because he hadn't been here, because he had chosen to run away, had buried himself in distant trips, had cut himself off from this house, telling everyone not to disturb him for anything unless it was truly urgent. He was the one who had built the wall between himself and his daughters, and now he was paying the bitterest price for that distance. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" he whispered. But the moment the question left his mouth, he already knew the answer. Eleanor looked at him, her gaze both compassionate and stern. "Because you were never here to hear it, sir. You were always gone, and every time you called home, you only asked about business, about the ships, about the contracts. Not once did you ask about your children." That sentence brought Tobias down completely. He covered his face with both hands, and for the first time since Diane had gone, he felt the full weight of the man he had become. Not a father, but a man who had shattered the most precious thing in only a few short seconds, because of his own selfishness and blind pride. He had driven away the only person who had brought light back to his children, and with his own hands, he had pushed them back into the darkness he had spent so much hopeless effort trying to pull them out of. Sitting there in the silent room, Tobias stared into nothing, and for the first time in his life, that powerful man did not know what to do to repair what he had broken. The next morning, Tobias did something he had perhaps never done in his entire life. He drove himself away from the mansion on the hill, crossed the city, and made his way to the poor working district where Ruth lived. The road led him into an old neighborhood, where cramped rows of houses leaned close together. The sidewalks were cracked, and the paint on the walls had faded with the years. A world impossibly far from the marble corridors and wide, echoing rooms he was used to. He found the right address, climbed the narrow stairs to the upper floor, and stopped in front of an old wooden door. He drew in a breath, then knocked. The door opened, but it wasn't Ruth. Standing before him was a tall, thin teenage boy, his eyes sharp and full of suspicion, his gaze sweeping over Tobias's expensive suit and polished shoes, with a look of scrutiny mixed with dislike. It was Silas, Ruth's younger brother, the boy she had raised with her own hands. "Who are you looking for?" Silas asked, his voice blunt, one hand still gripping the door as if he were ready to slam it shut at any moment. "I need to see Ruth Calloway," Tobias answered, trying to keep his voice calm. "I'm Tobias Marsh. I used to be her employer." The boy's expression hardened at once when he heard that name. "You're the man who fired my sister," Silas said. every word stained with anger. "You're the man who made her cry, who humiliated her in front of those little kids." Tobias felt his throat tighten. "I know I was wrong," he said. "That's why I'm here. I need to apologize to her." But Silas did not soften. He stepped forward, blocking the doorway with his slight but stubborn body. "She doesn't want to see you," he said. "Who do you think you are? You think you can just drive that fancy car here, wearing your expensive clothes, knock on the door, and fix everything with a few words? You don't know how badly you hurt my sister." Tobias stood there, and for the first time in his life, he realized there were doors his power could not open. All his life, money had opened everything. A nod from him could make ships change course, contracts get signed, stubborn men step back. And yet now, standing before a teenage boy in a poor neighborhood, all that power suddenly became meaningless. This boy wasn't afraid of him, didn't need anything from him, and nothing Tobias owned could buy the thing he was begging for. "Please," Tobias said, and the word sounded so unfamiliar coming from his mouth that even he barely recognized his own voice. "Just 5 minutes. I only need to speak with her for 5 minutes." Silas looked at him for a moment, his eyes unmoved. "She already gave you more than enough time," he replied, "and now you should go home." Then the door closed, firm and final, right in front of him. Tobias stood motionless in the narrow hallway, staring at the peeling paint on the old wooden door, his hands hanging at his sides before slowly tightening. Never in his life had he been refused so directly. Never had a door been shut in his face while he was left with nothing he could do. In his world, no one dared to do such a thing. But here, in this poor neighborhood where his suit looked painfully out of place, he was nothing more than a man who had caused hurt and was now being forced to bear the consequences. Slowly, he turned, walked down the stairs, and for the first time, he truly understood the price of what he had done, a price no amount of money in the world could ever pay. 2 days later, Tobias returned to that poor neighborhood, but this time, he carried something in his hands. It was a small cardboard box that Eleanor had found hidden beneath the girls' pillows while cleaning their room. He hadn't known what was inside until Eleanor opened it and showed him, and what he saw had kept him awake all night. This time, when Tobias knocked on the door, Ruth herself was the one who opened it. She froze when she saw him, her face tightening for an instant, and she started to close the door. But Tobias managed to speak first, his voice urgent in a way she had never heard before. "Please," he said, "I'm not here to convince you to come back. I only want to give you this." Then he held out the box, the hands of that powerful man trembling faintly. "The girls made these," he said. "They hid them under their pillows." Ruth hesitated, then reached out and took the box. Slowly, she opened the lid. Inside were drawings made with crayons. The young, unsteady strokes she recognized immediately, because she herself had once taped so many drawings like them onto the wall in the girls' room. One drawing showed a woman with brown hair standing between 2 little children, all 3 of them holding hands beneath a bright yellow sun. Beside the woman's figure, in a child's uneven handwriting, were the words, "Miss Ruth." Another drawing showed a house with lit windows, and above the roof, a paper boat floated among the clouds. And at the bottom of the box, carefully folded into fourths, was a piece of paper. Ruth opened it. On it, in letters that were uneven, trembling, and slanted by the hand of a child who had only just learned to write again, were a few words that made her heart clench. "Please come home to us. We love you." Ruth lifted a hand to cover her mouth. The tears she had tried to hold back for so many days now poured out beyond her control. She stood there, clutching the box to her chest, her shoulders shaking, looking at those drawings and those words as if they were tearing her heart open all over again. "The girls write these every night before bed," Tobias said softly, his own voice choked as well. Eleanor found them under Poppy's pillow. For a long while, Ruth couldn't say a word. Then, when she had steadied herself a little, she looked up at him, and through her tears, she spoke the things that had been pressed down inside her heart. "Do you know what those children had to overcome in order to open their hearts again?" she asked, her voice thick with emotion, but every word clear. "They were silent for 5 whole months. It took weeks of patience, so much tenderness, before they dared to trust again, before they dared to laugh, dared to sing, dared to live again. And yet in only a few seconds you shattered all of it. You didn't just hurt me, Mr. Marsh. You taught those 2 children a cruel lesson, that when people are frightened or confused, they hurt the very ones they love, that love isn't safe, that the people who are good to them will be pushed away. Tobias stood there with his head bowed, receiving each word from her like a sentence he knew he fully deserved. "I know," he said quietly. "I know I was wrong. I didn't come here to excuse myself. I only saw them come back to life, and I realized that a stranger had done what I, their own father, couldn't do. And instead of being grateful, I let my selfishness ruin everything." Ruth wiped her tears with the back of her hand, her eyes still wet but calmer now. She looked down at the drawings in the box, at the crooked handwriting of the two children she had come to hold as part of her own heart, and she knew that no matter how much anger the man standing before her deserved, she could never turn her back on the two little souls who were waiting day and night for her to return. Ruth held the box for a long while, then she lifted her head, and when she spoke, her voice no longer trembled. It had become strangely steady and clear. "I won't come back just because you came here begging, Mr. Marsh," she said. "And I won't come back just because of these drawings either, no matter how much they break my heart. If I return, it will be because of those two children, not because of you." Tobias raised his head and looked at her, a fragile glimmer of hope appearing in his eyes. "Anything you want," he said. "Just say it. I'll do it." But Ruth did not rush to seize that promise. She looked straight into his eyes, and what she said next left him silent. "The question isn't what I want," she replied. "The question is what you're willing to give up. You hurt your children not because you're cruel, but because you weren't there. Because you're always busy with work, with your trips, with that world of your own. So much so that you didn't realize your own daughters were coming back to life right before your eyes. If I return and everything stays the same, if you still disappear for weeks at a time and only come by now and then like a stranger visiting his own home, then I'll only be there to watch your children break all over again. And that is something I can't do." Tobias opened his mouth, about to say that he would rearrange things, that he would work from home more often, that he would cut back on his trips. But Ruth lifted a hand and stopped him. "I'm not talking about cutting back, Mr. Marsh," she said, her voice firm. "I'm talking about you truly being present. Present in the morning when your children wake up, present at dinner, present on the nights when they have nightmares and cry without knowing why. You can't chase after your empire and be a father to those two children at the same time. You have to choose." Those words hung between them, heavy and unforgiving. Tobias understood exactly what she was asking of him, and it made his chest tighten. His entire life, everything he had built, everything he had become, had revolved around power, around control, around the underworld he had ruled for so many years, and this woman was asking him to let it go. "I don't know if I can do it," he admitted, his voice rough. "I don't know how to simply stop. All my life, I've known only one road." Ruth looked at him, and for the first time, her eyes softened a little. "Then you learn," she said gently. "Learn the same way those two children are learning to trust again, one day at a time. No one is asking you to change everything overnight, but you have to begin, and you have to mean it, because I won't come back only to watch you break their hearts again. I won't be the one picking up the pieces while you're busy somewhere far away." Tobias was silent for a long time, and in that silence, he understood that this was not a negotiation like the ones he was used to. There were no numbers to bargain over, no terms to slip around. This woman didn't need his money, wasn't afraid of his power, and that was exactly what made her stronger than any opponent he had ever faced. She was forcing him to look directly at the man he was and decide for himself what truly mattered. At last, he nodded slowly. "Give me a chance to prove it," he said. "Not with words, with what I do." Ruth looked at him for a long time, as though weighing his answer. Then she quietly replied, 1 week. Give me 1 week to think. And if what you said is truly sincere, then you can wait 7 days." But those 7 days did not pass as peacefully as Tobias had hoped. The moment he began seriously thinking about withdrawing from the underworld, the moment word of his hesitation began leaking out through channels he had never expected, the people who had always lurked around the edges of his empire immediately caught the scent of opportunity. The Voss family, the rival gang that had long been eyeing the docks of Harrow Bay, was the first to strike. They understood that a lion wavering between two roads was a lion at its weakest, and they decided to attack at that very moment. Within only a few days, Tobias realized something was wrong. Shipments began disappearing in ways that made no sense. Several longtime partners suddenly turned their backs on him, pulling out of agreements that had already been signed. There were meetings that should have been known only to a handful of his most trusted people. Yet the Voss family knew every detail, as if they had eyes and ears planted right inside the heart of his empire. A trap was being laid, precise and carefully planned, meant to strangle his control over the docks and force him toward collapse. Tobias began following each thread, and the deeper he dug, the colder he felt down his spine. Because every clue led back to a place he never wanted to believe, a road pointing toward the man he had trusted completely for 10 long years. The leaked information was all information. Only a very small circle could have known. And among that small circle, only one name appeared at every connecting point: Gideon. His right hand, the man to whom he had once entrusted his life, the man who had always stood behind him in every confrontation. At first, Tobias pushed the thought away, telling himself it was the paranoia of a man who was exhausted and unraveling. And then, the final, most devastating piece of the puzzle clicked into place. It wasn't just the leaked contracts from today. It was the sudden, sickening confirmation of the one doubt Tobias had tried so hard to suppress. For months, a quiet question had haunted the back of his mind. Why had Gideon been the absolute first to arrive at the scene of Diane's accident, even before the police? Back then, grief had blinded him. But now, looking at the systematic betrayal at the docks, the horrifying truth was undeniable. Gideon hadn't rushed there out of loyalty. He had been there because he helped set the trap. The man he called brother was the one who sold his family out. Tobias sat alone in the dark, his hands clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white, anger and grief twisting inside him like a storm about to tear everything down. He knew he needed proof, needed certainty before he acted, because one mistake now could cost him everything. But deep in his heart, he could already feel the truth, a truth so bitter that he almost didn't dare face it. And he understood that before he could begin the new life Ruth had shown him, he would have to face the darkness of the past one final time. While Tobias was still wrestling with the bitter truth about Gideon, another calamity came at him from a direction he had not expected. That afternoon, as Ruth was on her way home from her extra job, a group of men stopped her in the empty alley near her boarding house. They were hired debt collectors, the kind of men who specialized in squeezing desperate loans out of poor people who had been forced to borrow in their most helpless hour. It turned out that, in order to pay for Silas's medicine when the boy had been seriously ill the year before, Ruth had borrowed money from loan sharks, and even though she had tried to make regular payments with her small wages, they still came after her, using the excuse of mounting interest to pressure her. The leader, a large man with a hard, stubborn face, blocked Ruth's path and threw out threats, demanding that she pay twice the amount of the debt at once if she didn't want trouble. Ruth took one step back, her heart pounding, but she did not collapse. She tightened her grip on the cloth bag over her shoulder, lifted her head, and looked straight into his eyes. "I don't have the money you're demanding," she said, her voice trembling but still steady. "I've paid every dollar I've earned, and I'll keep paying. But you have no right to force me to pay what I don't owe." The man gave a sneering laugh and stepped closer, his huge shadow falling over her. His companions tightened their circle too, cutting off every way out of the alley. The air stretched taut as a drawn wire. Ruth was backed against the wall, alone before the whole group. But she still tried to keep her back straight and refused to let fear swallow her whole. At the very moment the leader was about to raise his hand and grab her arm, a deep, cold voice sounded from the mouth of the alley, slicing through the air like a blade. "Take your hand off her." Everyone spun around. Tobias was standing there, his silhouette dark against the dimming light at the end of the alley, and behind him, several of his men appeared in silence. He walked forward, each step slow, yet carrying a force that made the entire group of thugs shrink back. The leader tried to recover his arrogance and asked who he was to dare interfere. But when Tobias stepped into the light and his face became clear, the man immediately understood who he had just crossed. The name Marsh was whispered through the group, and their earlier aggression suddenly dissolved, replaced by fear written plainly on every face. Tobias didn't need to strike anyone. He only had to stand there, his gaze passing over each man one by one, and speak in an even voice, with every word heavy as stone. "This woman is under my protection," he said. "Her debt, from this moment on, is my concern. And if any one of you dares touch her again, even a single hair on her head, then you'll understand why this whole city has learned to be careful with my name." The threat was not shouted, but it was enough to drain the color from every face in the group. The leader stammered a few words of apology, then signaled for his men to retreat, and within moments, the entire alley was empty of them. Ruth leaned against the wall, breathing hard, her legs still shaking from the terror she had just endured. Tobias stepped toward her, but this time, there was none of the cold authority in him that she had once seen in the kitchen that day. "Are you all right?" he asked softly, his voice full of worry. Ruth lifted her eyes to him, and in that moment, she realized something that made her heart sink into a quieter place. This man, the one she had believed knew only how to use power to impose and dominate, had just used that same strength for the first time not to subdue anyone, but to shelter someone weaker than himself. And that was the first moment, after all the anger and hurt, when she began to look at him with different eyes. After the night he saved Ruth from the debt collectors, Tobias knew he could not delay any longer. He had gathered enough of what he needed, had pieced together every fragment of the horrifying picture, and all of it pointed to one man. He had his people quietly watch Gideon for several days, and at last, on a night when thick fog blanketed the docks, he found what he was looking for. In an old warehouse buried deep inside the eastern loading district, where weak yellow light fell over stacks of high crates, Gideon was meeting with men from the Voss family. Tobias stood silently in the darkness, listening to every word, and each sentence that left the mouth of the man he had once considered a brother cut into his chest like a twisting knife. Gideon was discussing the plan to hand the remaining control of the docks over to the Voss family. He was bargaining over his share. He was speaking of Tobias with the contempt of a man who had waited too long to take his throne. And then, one careless sentence confirmed the most terrible thing of all, the thing Tobias had still prayed he had misunderstood. Gideon mentioned Diane, mentioned that fateful night 5 months earlier, with a chill that was almost inhuman, as if he were talking about a sacrificed pawn on a chessboard. He was the one who had sold her schedule to the enemy. He was the one who had opened the way for that cruel night. All of it had been for greed and ambition, for the desire to take what belonged to Tobias. At that point, Tobias could no longer hold himself back. He stepped out of the darkness. "Gideon," he called, and his voice rang through the cold warehouse, low and deep, yet carrying a rage powerful enough to freeze the blood in a man's veins. The entire warehouse went still. Gideon spun around, his face flashing with horror when he realized he had been discovered. But then he quickly recovered his shameless composure, his mouth curving into a half-smile. He knew there was no way back, so he no longer bothered to deny it. He admitted everything, from working with the Voss family to his role in Diane's death, and each confession poured more oil onto the fire burning inside Tobias. But the men from the Voss family did not let the two men face each other for long. They rushed in, and the warehouse instantly became a battlefield. Tobias's men, who had already been lying in wait by his order, surged out at the same time. In the flickering light of the old lamps, between stacks of crates piled like fortress walls, a fierce confrontation erupted. Tobias moved through that chaos with the cold precision of a man too familiar with battles of life and death. Every strike decisive, spare, and without hesitation. This was not only a fight to take back the docks. This was a reckoning for 5 months of pain, for his dead wife, for 2 children forced to grow up in silence, for everything that Traitor had stolen from him. The struggle was brutal. But the Voss men slowly weakened before Tobias's careful preparation, and one by one, they were subdued. In the end, only Gideon remained, with nowhere left to run, cornered inside the warehouse. He looked at Tobias, and for the first time, real fear appeared in his eyes. Tobias stepped forward and stood before the man who had destroyed his entire family. And in that moment, a lifetime of power urged him to act the way the underworld always acted. But he stopped. He thought of Ruth. He thought of his 2 children waiting for him to come home. He thought of the promise of a different man he was trying to become. "You're not worth my hands," Tobias said, his voice cold as ice. "You will pay, but not in the way you think. The law will handle the rest." Then he signaled for his men to turn Gideon, along with all the evidence of his crimes, over to the authorities. It was the choice of a man determined to step out of the darkness, and it was also the moment Tobias truly closed the darkest chapter of his life. Gideon's arrest and the crushing of the Voss family's scheme were only the beginning of what Tobias had to do next, because he understood that if he only removed one traitor while continuing to sit on the throne of the underworld, then sooner or later there would be another Gideon, another Voss family, and one day tragedy would knock on the door of his house again, this time perhaps taking not his wife, but his 2 little daughters. Ruth's words kept echoing in his mind, that he couldn't chase after his empire, and be a father to those two children at the same time, that he had to choose. And this time, he did not merely speak empty words. He began to dismantle the very empire he had spent his whole life building. It was not a simple task, and it was certainly not a safe one. In his world, no one easily let go of power and still survived, because once power left one man's hands, it immediately became prey for others to fight over, and those waiting in the shadows would not hesitate to erase the man who had stepped away in order to prevent future trouble. Tobias understood that better than anyone, but he still did it. He summoned the heads of the branches under his command, men who had followed him for years, and quietly rearranged everything. He handed control of the docks to those he believed would preserve the unwritten law he had once set down, the law that no one was ever to touch women, children, or the poor. He cut off each hidden tie, shut down each network, returned or liquidated everything that had to be let go. With every step, he knew he was stripping away the armor that had protected him for so many years, turning himself from someone untouchable into an ordinary man who could be wounded. But that was exactly the price he was willing to pay. There were nights when he sat alone reviewing everything, weighing each move carefully to make sure that when he withdrew, no enemy would still have a reason or an opportunity to come after his family for revenge. He used the very wisdom and reputation he had built over a lifetime to arrange an honorable retreat, a departure that would leave behind no power vacuum capable of igniting bloodshed. He met even with old rivals, negotiating quiet agreements to secure a lasting peace, trading away most of his wealth and influence to buy the only thing he truly needed, the safety of his children. To outsiders, it might have looked as if Tobias Marsh was throwing away with his own hands everything he had once desired, madly giving up an empire so many men would have coveted. But to Tobias, everything he set down made his chest feel a little lighter, as though he were casting off invisible stones that had weighed on his shoulders for years. For the first time in his life, he no longer had to sleep with one eye open, no longer had to suspect every handshake, no longer had to live in a world where trust was a luxury and betrayal waited behind every smile. When everything was finally complete, when the name the Man of the Docks had officially receded into the past, Tobias stood by the window of the mansion and looked down at the distant harbor that had once been his entire kingdom. And he felt no loss at all. He only felt free, because he knew that from now on, he would no longer be the boss who made the whole city tremble in fear, but simply the father of Poppy and Maisie, and that was a title he was prouder of than anything he had ever possessed in his whole life of power. On the 7th day, the final day of the deadline Ruth had set, she returned to the mansion on the hill. This time, she did not step through that gate with the hesitant heart of a hired worker, but with the heart of someone who had seen proof of real change in the man who had once hurt her. News of what Tobias had done had reached her, not through the words he told her, but through his undeniable actions, through the way he had cast off an entire empire in exchange for a peaceful home for his children. Eleanor was the one who opened the door to welcome her, and the two women only needed to look at each other to understand all the things that did not need to be spoken. "They have been waiting by the window since early morning," Eleanor whispered, her eyes already shining with tears. Ruth gave a small nod, then stepped inside, her heart beating faster with every step that carried her toward the familiar room. The moment she appeared at the threshold, time seemed to stop for one breath. Poppy and Maisie were sitting on the rug, and when their eyes caught sight of her, both of their little faces lit up like two flowers opening beneath the morning sun. "Miss Ruth," Poppy cried out, the name she had once written in crooked letters on the drawing hidden beneath her pillow now bursting into a real call. "Miss Ruth, you came home." Maisie cried too, her clear little voice now bright and full of life. Then both sisters sprang up and rushed toward her so fast that Ruth had to quickly sink to her knees and open her arms wide to catch them. Two small bodies crashed into her embrace, holding her tightly as if they were afraid that if they let go, she would disappear again. "We missed you so much. We thought you were gone forever," the two children said through tears, their stumbling words pouring out between sobs. Ruth held them both tightly against her heart, and she could not hold back the tears rolling down her cheeks either. But these were tears of happiness, tears from a heart that had once been broken and was now being mended again. "I'm home now, my sweet girls," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I'm home, and I'm not going anywhere anymore." On the other side of the room, Tobias stood quietly, watching the entire moment unfold. But this time, there was no trace in his chest of the dark emotion that had once swallowed him on that fateful night. There was no jealousy, no feeling of being replaced, no pain from being left outside. This time, When he saw his children come back to life in that woman's arms, he felt only a gratitude so deep it nearly took his breath away. He had learned, truly learned, that love was not something to be fought over or possessed, that a true father did not need to be the only person who made his children happy, but only needed to be the one who was always there to help nurture that happiness. And in that sacred moment, something strange happened. Out on the porch, the wind chime made from pieces of seashells that Diane had hung there years before, the chime that had stayed silent through the past 5 months of grief, as if it too had sunk into the sorrow of the house, suddenly began to ring. A gentle sea breeze passed through, and the seashells touched softly against one another, creating a chain of clear, delicate sounds, sweet as a whisper returning from some faraway place. Tobias turned his head toward the porch, and his throat tightened. Diane used to say that whenever they heard that chime ringing, it meant she was very near. The 2 children lifted their heads to listen too, their faces glowing with a tender joy, and Maisie softly whispered that it was Mama. Mama was here with them. Ruth held the 2 children close in her arms, looked up toward Tobias, and in the look the 2 of them shared, there was a new understanding. A beginning they both knew would not be easy, but would be filled with love and hope. Several months passed, and the mansion on the hill had changed completely. It was no longer a silent, cold place like a tomb, but had become a true home again, a place where children's laughter and voices once more rang through every room. Tobias had kept the promise he had made, not with empty words, but through the life he was living every single day. He was there every morning when his daughters woke up. He made breakfast for them with his own hands, even though nothing he cooked ever tasted as good as what someone else could make. He took them to school, knew the names of each of their friends, remembered every song they loved, sat beside their bed and told them stories every night, and stayed there to comfort them whenever they startled awake in the middle of the night. The man who had once made the whole harbor city tremble in fear now spent entire afternoons sitting on the floor, playing puzzles with his 2 little girls, and he had never felt so rich in all his life. As for Ruth, she was no longer merely a servant in that house. She had become an indispensable part of the family, the person the 2 children ran to when they were happy as well as when they were sad, the one who brought back the warmth and tenderness the house had been missing for far too long. Poppy and Maisie now chattered brightly all day. Poppy had begun asking questions about everything in the world again, just as she used to, while Maisie sang from morning until night, making up songs with funny little words that made the whole household burst into laughter. And whenever the sea wind blew across the porch, the wind chime made of seashells would ring out in clear, delicate notes, like a gentle presence watching over and protecting the whole family, like a reminder that true love never really disappears, but only changes into another form so it can remain beside those who are still living. The story of Tobias Marsh leaves us with a profound lesson, that true power does not lie in the ability to make others fear you, but in the ability to make the people you love feel safe and protected. And the worth of a human being has never been measured by outward appearance or by the wealth they possess, but by the heart and warmth they bring into the lives of others. Just as a poor woman once looked down upon because of her appearance became the very person who healed hearts that neither money nor power could reach. Sometimes, what a person needs most is not someone who comes to fix them, but simply someone willing to stay long enough, patiently enough, and lovingly enough to walk with them through their darkest days. If this story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, like, and share this video so we can spread more meaningful stories together and bring you many more moving stories every day. How do you feel about this story, and what part of it moved you the most? Please leave a comment and share the feelings that come from deep within your heart, because we always hope to hear those sincere emotions from you. Thank you for spending your time listening all the way to the very last moment. We wish you and your loved ones abundant health, a joyful life, peace, and serenity in every day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next stories.